Thank you, Chairman. Being an official of the Secretariat of the Parliament, I have, of course, to start with my usual disclaimer. Everything I'm going to say over the next 15 minutes is my personal view on things and cannot be construed as any official position of the European Parliament. Of course, I am confident that there are a few more people, both colleagues and parliamentarians, who share some of my opinions, but they are strictly personal as far as this conference is concerned. I would like to give you an impression about our work in the Secretariat on electoral and constitutional matters by trying to combine very briefly legal aspects and political and electoral aspects. And within the Secretariat, we often find ourselves in a situation where we have to balance what we often call in French sécurité juridique versus volonté politique. So these are the two aspects that often influence our work. And of course, you could translate this into a more academic jargon, and in a certain way, I think electoral questions are very strongly at the crossroads of political science and legal scholarship. But let me start with a story. In 1955, a long time ago, diplomats from 6 European countries were assembled and locked up, actually, in Val Duchesse, a castle in the southern part of Brussels. By the way, I have this story from Alan Little, who mentioned it in a very interesting talk he did last year in Edinburgh. And they were locked up for a couple of days under strictly secretive conditions, because each of the 6 member states was afraid that something could leak out about the preparations for the Economic Community Treaty. Now, if you this was almost like a conclave to elect the next pope. It was really an extremely confidential and secretive situation. Now, if you compare this to our situation today, you can appreciate that we have come a long way. If you look at this slide, I have to, of course, immediately make a declaration that I am not a member of the Green Party, and I'm not trying to convince you to vote for a Green candidate. But what I would like to try to show you here is what is called the Green primaries. The Green Party a few days ago has started to open this website, and you can, even if you're not a member, you have just to click that you share Green ideas. Well, for the purpose of my vote, I did so. But you're not obligatory a member of the party, and you can choose one of these 4 contenders for the presidency of the European Commission. And I will come back on this a bit later. But let me talk a few minutes about this tension between legal and political questions. As all of you know, the German Constitutional Court has issued a very important decision in 2009 concerning democracy at the European level. Well, formally it was on the revision of the Lisbon Treaty, but much of the content of the judgment actually referred to problems related to European democracy and the role of the European Parliament. And what I'm trying to say is that democracy is not anymore a reserve of political science. It has become an eminently legal question nowadays. Because what the German constitutional lawyers, and some others, by the way, were saying in this decision is that because of the right of German citizens to vote for the Bundestag, there is a need of absolute equality, electoral equality, and there's also a need for a certain minimum of powers, policy-making powers of the German Bundestag. If not, this constitutional right to vote would be violated. And the court goes on in the judgment by enumerating a rather long list of essential powers of the Federal Republic of Germany, which more or less cover all the policies that are still more or less under national control and predominance. So in a way, this judgment, you could see it as a red line drawn by the German Constitutional Court, and there are some similar decisions by other national constitutional courts, for any further expansion of EU powers. So here you have a very legal approach, and I would like to quote briefly one of my former colleagues while I had the pleasure to be a fellow here 2 years ago, Türkiye İstiksel. She writes in a very interesting article, if it is a category mistake, as Peter Linseth claimed in his recent book, Power and Democracy, to attribute standalone constitutional or democratic status to the EU, was it then also a category mistake to allow direct elections to the parliament or to introduce the status of union citizenship and the rights of political participation appended to it? So, as a matter of fact, the question from a legal and political point of view might arise whether it was some sort of fig leaf activity many years ago to adopt the Electoral Act, which then resulted in the direct elections to the European Parliament, or to introduce European citizenship at the Maastricht Treaty. And of course, our answer coming from the European Parliament is no, and we are convinced that European democracy in the long term must become a more and more independent political legitimacy channel from national parliaments and national political parties. I'm sure you all know the famous summary conditions for party government. This is an excerpt from Peter Mayer's last book. If you look over these 5 essential functions of representative government or party government, then applying it to the European situation, there is of course one obvious absent element, and that is the absence of a European government. So the long-term strategy would certainly be for the European Parliament to aim towards making the European Commission more like a European government. By the way, the former European Commission President Prodi had tried to ventilate this proposal from time to time, but it was certainly premature and did not fall on a very fruitful ground at this time. But on a more practical level, I would like to quote our Secretary General, Klaus Welle, who regularly speaks in Brussels for think tanks, research institutes, and who likes to underline that Parliament now and over the foreseeable future has 3 basic functions. It has to choose the executive, it has to legislate, and it has to exert scrutiny of the executive. Now, choosing the executive, we are of course in a very interesting phase now. I will come back to that a bit later. Speaking more precisely, more practically, more concretely about the European political parties, I mean, many of you will know this famous graph in Lisbeth Hoge's and Gary Mark's 2009 paper on a post-functionalist theory of European integration, where you can see that there is, at least in many member states, a huge discrepancy between the pro-Europeanness of elites and the anti-European or less pro-Europeanness of public opinion. Now, of course, this is a problem that touches upon European parties more than upon national parties, because, as you know, European parties do not have individual membership, so there are no big party congresses where individual members can select the party leadership. The European political parties are basically an association of national political parties. That's the current situation. Some of the work carried out at this institute and elsewhere encourage us to continue to work towards, let's say, a more effective European democracy. I just think about a recent paper written by Philipp Schmitter, where he says that if we had to choose the optimal solution for the current problems of European democracy, notably in the ever since the financial crisis came up, then we would need to create real European political parties. Mark Franklin also mentions regularly that instead of organizing what he calls a charade of European elections, we would need to give a genuine role to European citizens when they vote for the European Parliament. Professor Weiler regularly says that the problem is a problem of electoral structure and institutional structure. It is not a problem of a lack of interest by European citizens. So I would like to address some of these structural problems. Excuse me. For us, I think there are two principal categories related to making the European elections more consequential. The first category I would like to call the political or ideological category, and the second category is the structural category. Speaking briefly about the political and ideological problems of European democracy, of course, the first one is that you have one principle in both channels of institutional legitimation. You have the national political leadership determining, of course, the outcome of national parliamentary elections, but you also have the national political leadership determining the candidates to be elected to the European Parliament. I speak, of course, under the control of Luciano Bardi, who has done a lot of empirical work on this. And one recent anecdotal example for this unsatisfactory situation is that it is a well-known fact, apparently, among political scientists in one major member state. I'm not going to name it. And one of the biggest parties in this major member state apparently uses as the main criterion to choose its candidates for the European elections whether they are likely to be successful in the local elections or not. So those who are likely not to be very successful in local elections will be made candidates for the European elections. So here you have a practical example to what results it can lead if national political leadership decides on the candidates for the European elections. Another political problem is, of course, the old dimensional problem that you have the two big dimensions, left, right, and pro-European, anti-European, which are often not orthogonal but oblique, and a number of recent proposals go into the direction that at least the mainstream pro-European parties should start to stress the left-right dimension more than they did so up to now. Börzel and Risse have proposed this, for instance, and Ivan Krastev has also written a fascinating article last year where he says that how do we expect citizens to be fascinated by European elections if there is no real choice on economic policy making? The famous TINA phenomenon that Hans-Peter Grisi also mentioned this morning. But of course it's quite complicated to realign these two dimensions, and there are also national political leaders, even former MEPs, such as Alexander Stubb, who would perhaps not agree with this advice to go more for the left-right dimension. For somebody like Alexander Stubb, it is, the basic question is, are you a globalist or a localist? So this could be some sort of translation of being anti-European or pro-European in a slightly different phrasing. So these two basic dimensions, of course, play a role even in everyday campaigning. Just last week I attended a seminar in Strasbourg where two MEPs from the EPP and from the Social Democrats said that yes, we have two basic choices. On the first choice, we agree, that's the choice to be pro-European. On the second choice, we disagree. And this exactly, that's the situation that you have to get across in an electoral campaign. Coming to the structural problems on which we are working right now in the Parliament, I would distinguish short-term, mean-term, and long-term projects. The short-term project that you all know about is, of course, to choose candidates for the European Commission presidency. And this is a very interesting phenomenon going on at this moment. Almost all parties except the EPP have done so by now. And this could, in the end, this could mean that the EU is slowly being transformed into a more parliamentary system. Right now, you could probably be excused to call it a separate power system. But if the Commission President depends politically on the European Parliament, and if perhaps in a couple of years even members of the Commission will be chosen according to their political allegiance, then the EU might be slowly transformed into a parliamentary system. And perhaps 10 years from now we will look back and we will say that the 2014 elections were the start of it all. Among the short-term projects, I would like to mention a second one, and that is the reform of the European Political Party Statute. You all know that there has been a statute for 4 or 5 years now, which provides some financing for European political parties and their foundations. And currently there is a trilogue negotiation going on with the Council of Ministers on creating a statute for these parties that should be based on EU law. For the moment, these parties are associations according to Belgian law, and the idea now would be to create a statute based in EU law. A mean-term project, very briefly, would be, of course, to give some public profile, or you might even say branding, to the European political parties during the electoral campaign. You all know that in almost all member states, if you look at the party campaign posters, you always find the acronym of the national party, with very few exceptions. You never see the acronym of the European Party, EVP or SND. So citizens are really excused to think that this is basically a second-order national election. Another idea that is circulating in the Parliament and elsewhere would be to revise party funding in a more radical manner. One idea could be, for instance, that only European political parties that are successful in at least 3 or 4 member states should receive funding. So this would oblige European political parties to be active in several member states. I'm talking here about mean-term projects, not short-term projects. A long-term project would, of course, be to try to get a more sensible system of candidate selection for the EP elections. As you all know, and there's one, the European Parliament did a study in 2009 showing that the influence of the European political parties on candidate selections are almost zero. Right now we are doing a follow-up study, we are financing a follow-up study by the ULB on the same issue, and I trust that the results will not be very different. So one thing that at least a significant minority of MEPs is aiming at is a better system of candidate selection. This would of course mean that the vested interests of incumbents would need to be modified. And that's why I show you here a short selection of quotes from an EP plenary debate that took place in 2011 on 2 different reports. One report concerned the EU-wide constituency, on which I will not have the time to speak now, and the other concerned a more effective statute for the European political parties. And our criterion for selection for these quotes was to ignore all the Eurosceptic parties. So what you see here are quotes from members, I mean, these are not official party positions, of course. These are quotes from individual MEPs, but from parties that are rather pro-European mainstream parties. So this is just to illustrate that even within these mainstream pro-European parties, there is a considerable resistance both against more influential European political parties and the EU-wide constituency. So I think my time is over, and I would just like to finish with 2 quotes that show that all of this is not really new. Altiero Spinelli, with his with his historical materialism, had already the suspicion in 1944 that if the situation after the Second World War was not exploited immediately, it would be very, very difficult. L'occasione sarà persa per sempre. He was very pessimist, although he tried later on, as you know, to define a European constitution. The quote by Ernest Renan is more positive, but my favorite one is from our MEP from Britain, Andrew Duff, who usually says that if you work on electoral reform and on similar constitutional questions, you need a lot of persistence and a long life. Thank you very much.